Number 5. Eastern State Penitentiary. Starting off the list is Eastern State Penitentiary. It was a prison built in Philadelphia that wanted to stand out from the rest of the American penal system, trying out a new method of punishment called the Pennsylvania system. Well, do tell, what is the Pennsylvania system? It's not pleasant and has absolutely nothing to do with cheesesteaks. The Pennsylvania system refers to imposing the prisoners to solitary confinement all of the time, 24/7. The prisoners lived alone, ate alone, exercised alone, and were only ever allowed to interact with prison guards. When they were being transported or moved around the prison, the guards would make them don black hoods. Guess it's not nearly as sunny in Philadelphia as Frank Reynolds would have you believe. Now this might not surprise you, but this was not a terribly popular system with inmates. The miserable conditions made the inmates' lives horrendous, but the prison didn't care too much. The system only ended up collapsing in 1913 due to overcrowding in the prison. But Eastern State didn't let this stop them from acting sadistically, and really, if anything, just inspired them to get a little more creative. Prisoners would have their tongues chained to their wrists. Unruly, troublesome prisoners would be chained to chairs for days on end. They would douse prisoners in freezing cold water, and perhaps worst of all, would trap prisoners into a pit they affectionately nicknamed the Hole, where they'd be kept in the darkness for weeks on end. I'm really not sure if that's any better than the original system. In 1970, after decades of terrorizing its inmates, Eastern State let the last of its inmates free and closed the gates permanently, only to crack them back open a little bit as a tourist location, reopening its walls as a haunted attraction. Due to its horrific history and ominous atmosphere, the prison was rebranded as a haunt, with legends saying that you'll hear all kinds of disembodied laughter, screaming and crying, ghostly figures, shadows moving across the wall, and unexplained footsteps. And if you're looking for more scary stories about prisons or really about anything, then you're at exactly the right place. Stay subscribed to Top 5 Scary for more new scary videos every day. Number 4. Ohio State Reformatory. Ohio State is the picture of a perfect prison. I mean, literally, it was the set for the Shawshank Redemption, so it's kind of a big deal in the prison world. The prison first opened its gates in 1890 and was initially an intermediate penitentiary, a facility for first-time offenders who were deemed too violent to be in other prisons. The inmates were taught basic trades for release and reintegration. However, the prison population started to swell too much by the 20th century, and the reformatory was forced to accept inmates convicted of serious crimes. While day-to-day operations weren't too terribly out of the norm for any other prison, one event in the 1930s may have contributed greatly to the paranormal rumors surrounding it. In the late 1930s, a riot broke out in the East Cell Block, and as punishment, the guards rounded up 120 rioters to share 12 solitary confinement cells together for a week without any food or water. Obviously, this led to multiple prisoners passing away, and even more being broken down to the point of madness. Just outside the prison stands 215 numbered graves, a monument to all the horror that the prison had experienced over the years. Since then, the prison itself has reformed, rehabilitating itself much like Eastern State as a haunted house. Visitors and tour guides who walk through Ohio State report feeling inexplicable chills while walking through the prison's walls. Witnesses say they hear cell doors slam and see dark figures. Those brave enough are welcome to take the prison's tour and attempt to track down spirits of their own, or if you're feeling particularly festive for the Halloween season, you can try the Haunted Prison Experience, a guided tour replete with animatronics and actors for that haunted house feel. Number 3. Missouri State Penitentiary. Once dubbed the bloodiest 47 acres in America, it is no surprise at all that Missouri State Pen is home to all kinds of rumors to be haunted by the souls of its former inmates. The prison was nicknamed The Walls, and shortly after its construction was already home to 2,000 inmates, doubling that size in the progressing years. The prison was home to several riots and escape attempts, with the most infamous attempt occurring in 1954, when some 2,500 inmates participated in a massive day-long riot. 4 buildings burned and the National Guard was called in. Shockingly, out of this, only 4 inmates were fatally injured during this event, and none managed to escape, lending to the prison's hard reputation. Now, the prison has always been reported to be haunted, even during its operation, with both guards and inmates during its service claiming to see spectral apparitions. Most of the ghost stories come out of the prison's oldest building, the A building, home to some of the crueler punishments, including an underground room called the Dungeon, a dank, hostile basement with a low ceiling forcing prisoners into a subservient position where the only light that could be observed was a slit through the door. Modern visitors to the dungeon complain of the disgusting odor of bodies that's pungent, and they feel like they're being watched. Disembodied voices have even even been picked up by EVP monitors while wandering through the dungeon. In the control room, visitors report occasionally seeing a spirit called Fast Jack, a medical practitioner from the prison's operating days, who can be seen appearing as a ghastly figure holding a clipboard and a white lab coat, frantically scurrying around the control room trying to carry out some duty from when he was alive, slamming lockers and opening doors. Several ghost hunting groups over the years have investigated the Missouri State Pen, including legendary ghost hunting hero Zach Baggins and the Ghost Adventures crew, finding mysterious voices and what looked like shadow people wandering the halls. Although the bloodiest 47 acres in America might have dried up and the walls are now open to the public, for the inmates who are still impounded there, it's as terrifying as ever. Number 2. West Virginia Penitentiary. Almost heaven. West Virginia, Blue Ridge Mountains, and haunted prisons. The Appalachians might be home to one of the most beautiful parts of the United States, but West Virginia Penitentiary is anything but. In 1863, after West Virginia seceded from Virginia Classic, the new fledgling state needed its own prison, and Moundsville, West Virginia, was chosen as the home for their new state pen. The prison's conditions were unlivable. West Virginia Penn frequently made the Department of Justice's top 10 violent prisons in the country. Idea for a new video. An infamous spot in the prison was known as the Sugar Shack, a small rec room for the inmates that served as a hotbed for all kinds of violent illegal activity. The prison is also home to a famous electric chair that an inmate was forced to build, nicknamed Old Sparky. Old Sparky is still standing there today. In the 1950s, the prison was so overcrowded that 3 prisoners at a time would be shoved into one cramped 7 by 5 foot cell. The men were kept like animals in cages. Riots and violent outbursts were fairly commonplace. The prison was overcrowded, dilapidated and run down, and staffed by overwhelmed guards. Eventually, the prison would be forced to open its gates, decommissioning as a prison and shipping all of its inmates elsewhere. The building still stands and is used as a training facility for law enforcement officers, but it's been said that the spirits of those whose lives ended here still wander. Hunters report equipment malfunctioning walking by the Sugar Shack or any of the cell blocks where the more violent inmates were housed. Reports of banging on the walls late at night, as well as random screams, are fairly commonplace too. The prison was reportedly haunted while inmates still populated it, with some of the earliest stories of hauntings stemming from the 1930s. It's thought that the prison was built on top of an indigenous gravesite of the Adena people, which has led to some speculation as perhaps an explanation for the hauntings. Like most of the prisons on this list, if you're curious enough yourself, West Virginia Penn is available to visit for tours, and you can even pop by the Sugar Shack and Old Sparky. And finally, number 1, Alcatraz. Alcatraz might very well be the United States' most infamous prison. On Alcatraz Island, just outside of San Fran, lies the notorious jail, built to house America's most deadly inmates, like Al Capone, Arthur Barker, or George Kelly. It was home to a legendary breakout that was made into a film, Escape from Alcatraz, and also set the stage for Michael Bay's action classic The Rock, which was about breaking into Alcatraz. The prison was built to drain the hope out of inmates, to break the spirits of the most rebellious inmates, and was legendary for its awful conditions. Tiny cramped cells, indifferent guards, and frequent bouts of violence and riots were all commonplace. It was once referred to as the Great Garbage Can of San Francisco, where every other federal prison dumped their worst apples. So it's no surprise, given its brutal conditions, that the island is home to several spirits and hauntings from souls that just can't move on. Most ghost investigators report that the hottest spot for paranormal activity in the building is cell 14D, a cell that was also nicknamed the Hole. Gotta wonder if they borrowed that from Eastern State. It was where the most unruly prisoners would be kept when they were being difficult. It's been said that even walking by 14D, you'll immediately feel something's wrong, as if a dark presence or energy is in the room with you. An inmate once spent his last days in 14D, screaming that he was being hunted by an otherworldly creature. Visitors report hearing crying and moaning while walking through cell blocks A, B, and C, where most of the population would have been kept. It's said that a ghost named the Butcher walks through these halls after an inmate named Butcher Malkowitz, a mob hitman, was whacked by another inmate. Now, if this isn't enough haunting for you, some dark tourists also report hearing discordant, disembodied banjo strumming, thought to be a holdover from the spirit of Al Capone, who used to play his banjo in the prison band. Although the prison was decommissioned in 1963, it reopened shortly after, now as a museum and a haunted tour popular with Bay Area locals and visitors curious about learning about one of America's darkest prisons and perhaps its most haunted. Visit if you dare, but just make sure you're able to leave.
Alcatraz Penitentiary, The Rock. There is no American prison more infamous, and no group of inmates more notorious.
Starting off in our number 5 spot, Warden Johnson. James A. Johnson was the first and longest serving warden at Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary. He was warden from 1934 until he retired in 1948. He was said to be extremely strict and a devout reformist who imposed a number of rules upon the prison, including a strict code of silence, which led him to be named the Golden Rule Warden. One day the warden was showing some of his guests from out of town around the prison. According to the story, the warden and his group heard someone sobbing from inside the prison walls. And as you might remember, I just said that the warden had a strict code of silence. When he was heading in the direction of where the sobbing was coming from, a cold wind whisked past him. He never could explain why this happened, and he never did find out who was sobbing. And at number 4, cell blocks A, B, and C. Visitors who have gone to cell blocks A, B, and C claim they have heard crying and moaning. A visiting psychic also once wrote that while in Block C, he encountered a disruptive spirit named Butcher. Prison records also show that another inmate in Block C murdered Abby Meldowitz in the laundry room. Abby was a mob hitman, and guess what his nickname was? That's right, Butcher. Also, another incident in cell block C took place on September 5th, 1984, when a ranger spent the night alone on the island and was awakened by a heavy door swinging in C block. This also happened to be the cell where the Butcher's killer stayed. At number 3, investigations. There have been numerous paranormal investigations that have taken place in this prison. Psychics such as Annette Martin and Jan Borgen have tried to contact spirits at Alcatraz. Jan Borgen actually paired up with a skeptical morning radio news anchor named Ted Wagon, and the two spent the night there. Ted was sure they wouldn't find anything. They fell asleep, and then around 3 a.m. in the utility corridor, a place where 3 inmates were shot dead back in 1946 during the Battle of Alcatraz, Ted said he got a tremendous feeling of anger and felt an evil presence lying on the floor at the place where the men died. He began to swear and said that he felt strong compulsion to fire a gun at people. Then later in 1984, another paranormal investigator named Michael Curry claimed that he visited the prison and in a trance had spoken to the spirit of a man who told him he had been beaten and had his legs broken and was then placed in solitary confinement. Coming at number 2, cell 14D. One of the cells in the hole is believed to be very active with spirits, and it's said to be the most haunted cell in the prison. During tours, people tend to get a really eerie vibe while in that area. Even employees of the tour company have claimed to feel what they can only describe as a raw coldness in that section of the former prison. Others have even said they feel a sense of insanity as they approach the cell. Tales have actually been told about something that happened there in the 1940s. Apparently, one time when a prisoner was locked in cell 14D, they claimed throughout the night that a creature with glowing eyes was in there with him and that he was going to kill him. The next day, the guards went to the cell to check on him, and they found him strangled to death in his cell. To this day, no one has claimed responsibility for the convict's death. The next day, the guards were doing head counts, and they ended up counting one too many prisoners. When looking back through the papers, they realized they counted the prisoner that had just passed away. Some of the guards claimed to have seen him in the lineup with other inmates, but only for a second before he vanished. Yeah, if I was those guards, I would be terrified. I would feel like this guy was coming back with a vengeance. At number 1, Al Capone. Al Capone was one of the most notable prisoners of Alcatraz. Capone was transferred to Alcatraz as one of the first prisoners of the new federal prison. While in prison, Capone's health was quickly declining. He had contracted a form of syphilis when he was younger, and it began to take over his brain. By 1938, he was spending all of his time at the prison, either in the hospital or the shower room. While his health was declining, he decided to take up playing the banjo. He developed a fear that he would be killed if he spent his recreational time in the prison yard, so he received permission to spend his free time practicing his banjo in the shower room. He liked it in there as the acoustics were better. Soon enough, his health got even worse, and he was transferred out of Alcatraz to the California Federal Correction Institution at Terminal Island. He was patrolled shortly after and ended up passing away in 1947 from cardiac arrest. However, in the recent years, a park ranger claimed he heard banjo music coming from the shower room. He was unfamiliar with the deep history of Alcatraz, so he documented this event. And oddly enough, other visitors and employees have reported hearing the sound of a banjo coming from the prison walls.
Coming in at number 5, we have Tadmor Prison in Syria. Tadmor Prison was located in Tadmor in the deserts of eastern Syria. It was a prison known for harsh conditions, extensive human rights abuse, torture, and summary executions. It was ultimately captured and destroyed by militants of the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant in May 2015. Built in the 1930s by the French, Tadmor's notoriety began 40 years later during the rule of Hafez al-Assad. Some of the horrendous atrocities reported at Tadmor are soldiers killed between 500 and 1,000 prisoners in one day, medical treatment was scarce, with guards telling inmates only callers to collect bodies. Guards held a reception party for incoming inmates that involved hitting them up to 400 times. Guards forced 2 inmates at a time to hold a third by his arms and legs and threw him across the room. When a man refused, he was beaten so severely that he died soon after. Inmates couldn't lift their eyes from the ground and would distinguish nice guards from sadistic ones by the color of their boots. During the 1980s, Tadmor prison, housed of Syrian prisoners, was the location of one of the worst prison massacres. Members of units of the defense brigades under the command of Rafael al-Assad entered Tadmor prison at dawn and killed an estimated 1,000 prisoners in the cells and dormitories. In May 2015, Tadmor was captured by the Islamic State, who also took over the prison and released a video of its interior. ISIL militants used explosives to blow up the prison complex on May 30th. Coming in at 4, we have Camp 22, North Korea. Camp 22, also known as Horyang concentration camp, was a prison camp in North Korea that was reported to have been closed in 2012. The official name was Kwalso, Penal Labor Colony number 22. The camp was a maximum security area completely isolated from the outside world. Now, the conditions in the camp were reportedly horrific. Former guard Ahn Myung-chul describes the conditions in the camp as harsh and life-threatening. He recalls the shock he felt upon his first arrival at the camp, where he likened the prisoners to walking skeletons, dwarfs, and cripples in rags. Ahn estimated that about 30% of the prisoners had deformities such as torn off ears, smashed eyes, crooked noses, and faces covered with cuts and scars resulting from beatings and other mistreatment. Single prisoners lived in bunkhouses with 100 people in a room. As a reward for good work, families were often allowed to live together in a single room inside of a small house without running water. Prisoners had to do hard physical labor in agriculture, mining, and inside factories from 5 a.m. to 8 p.m., followed by ideological re-education and self-criticism sessions. The mines were not equipped with safety measures, and according to Ahn, prisoners were consequently killed almost every single day. Torture was inflicted every day at Camp 22, with Ahn reporting the following torture methods. Water torture. The prisoner must stand on his or her toes in a tank filled with water to his nose for 24 hours. Hanging torture. The prisoner is stripped and hung upside down from the ceiling to be violently beaten. Boxroom torture. The prisoner is detained in a very small solitary cell, in which there is barely enough room to sit, but not stand or lie, for 3 days or a week. Not to mention kneeling torture, as well as pigeon torture. It was also rumored that human experimentation took place at the camp as well. Coming in at number 3, we have La Sabaneta prison, Venezuela. La Sabaneta prison, also known as the Maracaibo prison, was a notoriously violent prison in the city of Maracaibo, Venezuela, in the state of Zulia. It was operated by the Ministry of Prison Systems, most recently under Minister Iris Varela from 1958 to 2013. Typical of a Venezuelan prison, it was severely overcrowded, with inadequate access to medical care, food, and clean water, and violence among prisoners was common. Gangs of prisoners had control over the prison and were led by a pran, meaning inmate leader. The prison was ultimately closed after 55 years of operation due to government intervention, and is now being converted into a museum. At one period of time, the prison was home to 3,700 inmates, with the prison being built to occupy just 700. Of this number, an estimated 192 of them were children of the inmates. The prison was run by prisoners themselves, following the trend of 80% of Venezuelan prisons which are run by the prisoners. Now, on January 3rd, 1994, a riot broke out in the prison as a result of ongoing gang activity. A fire was started by a group of inmates, and then they subsequently shot or stabbed other inmates who tried to escape the fire. While there was some dispute over the number of casualties and injuries during the incident, many of the prisoners were killed when security personnel attempted to take control of the prison, with some sources claiming over 150 casualties. The riot brought attention to the poor conditions in Venezuelan prisons and is often cited as one of the deadliest prison incidents in history. Coming in at number 2, Gldani prison, Georgia. The horrors going on at the Gldani prison first came to public attention in 2012, when video footage was leaked which contained scenes of guard on inmate assault, torture, and even sexual assault. This quickly became a political scandal in the country of Georgia. The scandal was unique unique in Georgian history in that it was initially shared and discussed on social media before the story began to appear on Georgia's largely pro-government television channels. Besides the images of stark physical abuse, which included the use of broomsticks and lit cigarettes, the videos displayed abuse perceived as having implications related to homosexuality, which is a largely taboo subject in Georgia's ultra-conservative religious culture. Overcrowding, poor medical care, and unsanitary conditions pale in comparison to the reign of terror and sexual abuse that the prison guards indulged in. To make the situation worse, most of the inmates were petty criminals and thieves, with there likely being a large amount of innocent men behind those bars getting tortured. And finally, coming in at number 1, we have Carandiru Penitentiary, Brazil. Carandiru Penitentiary was a prison located in Sao Paulo, Brazil, originally designed and built by Samuel das Neves, all the way back in 1920, when it was considered a model prison to meet the new demands of the 1819 Criminal Code. The prison was operational between 1956 to 2002, and was at one period of time South America's largest penitentiary, housing over 8,000 inmates. However, in 1992 it was the site of the Carandiru massacre. The massacre was triggered by a prisoner revolt. Around 1:30 p.m, two groups of people got into a fight following a game of football. The fight escalated into a prison riot that lasted around 3 hours. According to reports, prisoners were attacking one another with knives and even pipes. The riot consisted of around 2,069 inmates versus just 15 guards, resulting in the guards losing control over the situation. The military was ultimately called, with the prisoners being stripped, locked in their cells, and shot. Other prisoners were killed by police dogs. To make matters worse, the facility was a detention center, not a prison, meaning the inmates had not been tried or convicted. By the end of the day, 111 prisoners were killed and 37 more were injured. Police were also reported to have killed witnesses, wounded prisoners, and even those forced to remove bodies. The prison was demolished on December 8, 2002. One block was left intact to be used as a museum, now open to public. Some trivia for you guys: the Carandiru Penitentiary was the inspiration for the penitentiary scene in season 3 of Prison Break.